I remember the evening like it was just yesterday, despite the years that have washed over the memory, softening the edges but never quite erasing the chilling details. I was working as a camp counselor in the lush, expansive forests of northern Vermont, where the air was always crisp and laden with the scent of pine and fresh earth. Our campsite, nestled alongside the serene Lake Champlain, was a slice of tranquil wilderness perfect for molding young minds and fostering a love for the great outdoors. That summer, I had the pleasure and challenge of overseeing a boisterous group of 10-year-old boys, eager for adventure and always ready for mischief. My co-counselor, a rugged outdoorsman named Dan, and I had planned a weekend camping trip at a remote site along the lake. The day was filled with the typical camp activities: canoeing across the glassy water, setting up our cluster of tents, and teaching the boys how to start a fire without matches. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, we gathered around the campfire. The boys roasted marshmallows until they turned into gooey, charred blobs, and we shared stories that ranged from silly to spooky, laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire. By 9:30 p.m., the excitement of the day had worn them down, and I announced bedtime. They retreated to their tents, a small distance from our main campsite, but still within a shout's reach. Dan and I stayed by the water's edge, enjoying the solitude and the soft lapping of water against the shore as we shared a couple of cigarettes. The night was pitch black, save for the stars scattered like diamond dust across the sky. We were just about to douse the fire and head to our own tent when a soft glow appeared on the lake. At first, it seemed like a trick of the eyes, a mirage created by the darkness. But as it drew closer, the light took on a steady intensity, fixed at the front of an approaching kayak. Dan and I stood up, alert and cautious. Part of our training as camp counselors involved handling unexpected encounters, especially in a setting where we were responsible for children. I prepared myself to give the customary spiel to the mysterious visitor, asking them to respect our privacy and find another place to camp. As the kayak neared, the figure paddling it became visible, a woman, seemingly in her 60s, with long, wispy gray hair that trailed into the water like seaweed. Her skin was weathered and tough, resembling old leather, and her eyes, though difficult to see beneath the wrinkles, held a haunting emptiness. She fixed her gaze on me, and when she spoke, her voice was raspy, almost whisper-like, revealing a mouth mostly devoid of teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked, her head tilting towards the tents. I was taken aback, my heart pounding in my chest. I managed to nod and told her that yes, the children were fine and that it was best if she moved on. She smiled, a chilling, knowing smile, and said, "That's good. Just as expected for this time." Then, without another word, she turned her kayak and paddled away into the darkness. Dan and I exchanged a look of mutual unease. The woman's presence and her questions about the children left us deeply unsettled. We decided not to retire just yet, opting instead to keep the fire burning a while longer. We grabbed our hunting knives for reassurance and made a round to check on the kids. All were sound asleep, oblivious to the night's eerie interruption. About half an hour later, as we sat in the flickering light of the dying fire, my phone buzzed with a text from Jess, a female counselor who was leading another group across the lake. The message read, "Hey Alex, stop messing around. This isn't funny. My kids are freaked out." Confused and concerned, I called her immediately, explaining that we had just encountered a strange woman by our site and assured her that I wasn't behind any pranks. Jess's voice shook as she recounted how one of her campers had seen a figure with long, flowing hair standing by the shoreline, arms outstretched as if waiting for someone. or something. The revelation that Jess and her group had also seen the woman sent a cold shiver down my spine. I reassured her that we would stay vigilant and suggested she do the same. Dan and I agreed that sleep would be elusive, so we stoked the fire back to life and settled in for a long, watchful night. Our minds raced with possibilities. Who was this woman? Was she simply a local eccentric, or was there something more sinister at play? Her eerie demeanor and unsettling questions about the children were far from comforting. We discussed every scenario, from her being a lost wanderer to something out of local folklore that neither of us wanted to truly consider. Hours ticked by slowly, with each snap of a twig or rustle of leaves heightening our anxiety. The fire's glow became our small island of safety against the vast darkness of the lake and woods. Then, around midnight, the stillness was broken by the distant sound of a paddle dipping into the water. We grabbed our flashlights and hurried to the shore, scanning the black water for any sign of movement. At first, there was nothing but the gentle waves. Then, the light from another campsite across the lake caught the silhouette of a kayak, unmistakably hers, gliding smoothly across the surface. She was moving away from us, toward the darker parts of the lake where the moonlight couldn't reach. Neither Dan nor I dared to shout or draw attention to ourselves. We watched in silence until she disappeared from view, the sound of her paddle fading into the night. The rest of the night passed without further incident, but the tension never left us. We kept the fire blazing until the first hints of dawn tinged the sky. The morning brought with it a palpable relief as the boys emerged from their tents, sleepy and unaware of the night's events. Dan and I decided not to unsettle them with the story, instead focusing on packing up and getting everyone ready to canoe back to camp. The normalcy of breakfast and the morning's chatter did little to ease the unease that clung to me. Once back at the main camp, we reported the incident to the camp director, who listened with a furrowed brow. He promised to inform the local authorities and to keep an extra watch on the camp's surroundings. Jess and I exchanged our experiences, finding solace in the shared ordeal but no answers. The woman became a specter in my memories, a ghostly figure paddling silently across the lake. I found myself looking over my shoulder during subsequent trips, half expecting to see her haunting visage. The encounter became my go-to story around campfires, a tale that never failed to chill the bones of listeners. But for me, the mystery remained, a shadow on the edge of reality, never fully explained. Years later, I still wonder about her intentions and her eerie knowledge of our presence. Was she merely passing through, a remnant of a life spent in isolation, or something more? The lake, with its serene waters and dark depths, keeps its secrets well, and perhaps some are better left undiscovered. The excitement was palpable as Jeff and I packed up the SUV for our weekend getaway. The routine of city life in Lexington had worn us thin, and the promise of isolation at the gorge, a secluded expanse of forest in eastern Kentucky, felt like just the escape we needed. It was our first real outing alone as a couple, without the usual gaggle of friends or the bustling noise of family to buffer our interactions. Just us, the woods, and hopefully a bit of adventure. We left on a Friday, right after work, our gear stashed haphazardly in the back. The drive took a couple of hours, filled with Jeff's indie playlists humming softly through the car speakers and my restless fidgeting. As the cityscape receded into the rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills and thickening forests, a sense of freedom began to settle in. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravel parking lot. That's when we saw them, Two guys emerging from an old Volkswagen camper van parked a few spaces down. They were rugged, with a wild, unkempt look about them that didn't sit right with me. Our eyes met briefly, and there was a sharpness in their gaze that made me uneasy. "Creepy," I muttered under my breath as they ducked back into their van without a word. Jeff caught the tail end of my comment as he slammed the car door shut. "Don't worry about it," he said with a reassuring grin, pulling the straps of his backpack tighter. "Let's get moving before it gets too dark to find our spot." The hike to our campsite was less than a mile, but the terrain was rough, dotted with rocks and roots that demanded careful attention. I had been here before, a few times with friends, and I knew the area well enough. We passed several potential spots, but I had a specific one in mind, nestled near a bend in the river where the sound of rushing water filled the air with a calming presence. As we set up camp, the light faded fast, and the forest seemed to close in around us. There was a thrill to it, a raw edge of wilderness that made our little tent feel like a lone bastion against a world of shadows. We were just about to start a fire when he appeared out of nowhere. A man, older, with a grizzled beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. "Need some firewood?" he asked, his voice gravelly, carrying an odd, unsettling friendliness. I was taken aback by his sudden appearance. "No, thanks," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "We'll manage." He chuckled, a low sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good luck," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the woods. "I've pretty much cleared out everything nearby. Been here a while, you see." His comment struck me as odd. How long had he been out here? And why so close to our campsite? But before I could say anything, he continued, "Been camping up that hill for nearly a month now. Just me and the birds," he added with a wry smile. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Jeff seemed to sense it too, his body tense beside me. "We should get that fire going," Jeff said, a subtle nudge for the man to leave. As the stranger turned to walk away, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "If you need anything, I'm just up the hill. Name's Carl." Once he was out of earshot, Jeff and I exchanged a look. "That was weird, right?" I whispered. "Definitely weird," Jeff agreed. "But hey, it's just one guy. We'll be fine." With a concerted effort, we focused on building our fire, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling left in the wake of our visitor. Night had fully descended now, wrapping the forest in a blanket of darkness that was only broken by the flickering light of our growing fire. The sounds of the night came alive around us. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, and the distant roar of the river. It was peaceful, in a way that only true wilderness can be. We roasted marshmallows and shared stories, our laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire. But as the hours passed, a disquiet settled in my stomach. The man's words echoed back to me, his claim of being alone, yet the brief yelling I had heard earlier near the trailhead said otherwise. And then, the snapping of twigs around our tent later that night brought everything sharply into focus. Someone was out there, moving silently through the darkness. "We need to leave," I said suddenly, the decision crystallizing with clarity that surprised even me. Jeff looked at me, alarm clear in his eyes, but he nodded. "We'll pack up at first light," he agreed quietly. But as we lay in our tent, the sounds continued, closer now, more deliberate. Fear spiked through me, stark and chilling. Whatever sense of security we had felt earlier was gone, replaced by the visceral understanding that our uninvited neighbor might not be as benign as he appeared. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig pricked at our nerves, pulling us further from rest and deeper into a state of vigilance. Whispered conversations filled the tent as we debated our next steps, the sounds of the night pressing in on us from all sides. At first light, a gray, misty dawn broke over the gorge, providing just enough visibility to see the outlines of trees and the path back to our car. We decided not to wait any longer. Hastily, we packed up our tent and our belongings. Our movements hurried but silent, the urgency of our situation fueling us. We left the campsite as it was, not bothering to clean up the remnants of last night's fire. Time felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. As we shouldered our packs, the forest seemed to watch us, the dense canopy of leaves muting the morning light into a somber twilight. Every step away from the campsite tightened the knot of tension in my stomach. The crack of a branch from somewhere behind us quickened our pace, transforming our silent retreat into a barely contained run. Leaving so soon? The voice sliced through the morning stillness, halting us in our tracks. It was Carl, his figure emerging from the shadowy underbrush, blocking our path back to the trailhead. His presence was menacing, a stark contrast to the feigned friendliness of last night. The wild look in his eyes, the set of his jaw, everything about him screamed danger. "Yes, we have to get back," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. Jeff stood slightly in front of me, his body tensed for any needed action. Carl stared at us for a moment, his gaze unnerving. Then, as if deciding something, he stepped aside, but not without a parting remark that sent chills down my spine. "Too bad. It's lovely here at dawn," he said, his tone light, but his eyes never losing that sharp, calculating glint. We didn't respond, just continued our hurried pace towards the safety of our vehicle. The presence of the van, those two men from yesterday, was no longer there, which was a small relief, but did little to ease the fear that Carl wasn't acting alone. Upon reaching the SUV, the relief was palpable. We threw our gear into the back and didn't even bother to organize it as we normally would. As I started the engine and pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on us, watching our departure. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, replaying the events of the night. Once we reached the city's outskirts, where the familiar signs of civilization began to replace the wild, untamed beauty of the gorge, I found my voice. "We need to report him," I said, the decision clear in my mind. Jeff nodded in agreement, his jaw set. "Yes, no one should go through that. He might not just scare the next ones." The local ranger station was our next stop. We relayed everything, the unsettling encounter, the strange behaviors, and our hasty departure. They took us seriously, thankfully, and promised to look into it. They seemed particularly interested in the description of the Volkswagen van and its occupants. "It's not the first time we've had reports of odd incidents around that area," one ranger admitted, which did nothing to ease the discomfort that had settled in my bones. Leaving the station, the world seemed different, darker, somehow, or perhaps I was seeing it with new eyes. The experience at the gorge had changed something fundamental in us, a loss of naivety, perhaps, or the harsh reminder that the wilderness, for all its beauty, could harbor dangers not just from the elements, but from the unpredictability of human nature. As we finally reached home, the safety of familiar walls was a balm to our frayed nerves. We unpacked in silence, each movement tinged with the echo of twigs snapping in the dark. The gorge had offered us a test, one we hadn't anticipated, and while we had escaped unscathed, the shadows it cast lingered long in our minds. That night, under the security of our own roof, sleep came uneasily. The wilderness had been an escape, a place of beauty and peace, but it had shown us another face, one that whispered with the voices of unseen watchers and echoed with the soft, deceitful intonations of those who walk in the shadows. It was a lesson we would not soon forget. Living just a stone's throw away from the vast stretches of Oregon's forests, I had always taken solace in the quiet that nature afforded. My love for the outdoors had compelled me to purchase an old RV, which had become my occasional retreat from the hustle and bustle of suburban life. This weekend, driven by a spontaneous urge, I decided to escape to one of my favorite lesser-known spots, a small campground nestled between towering pines and firs about 30 miles from my home in Medford. As I steered my RV down the familiar winding road leading to the campsite, the dense canopy of trees overhead signaled my entry into a different world, one where cell service faded and the sounds of civilization were replaced by the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. The campground, a small clearing surrounded by nature, was usually empty, catering to those few who preferred solitude over the more crowded state parks. I arrived mid-afternoon with the sun high in the sky, casting dappled shadows across the grassy area where I parked my RV. I stepped out into the fresh air, taking a deep breath that filled my lungs with the crisp scent of pine. With no one else around, I set about making the place homey, pulling out the overhanging tent and setting up my portable chair and table. The plan was simple: relax, perhaps do some reading, and enjoy a quiet night under the stars. After setting up, I decided to gather some firewood for the evening. Venturing into the woods behind my RV, I was reminded of how much I loved these spontaneous adventures. The forest floor was damp, evidence of a recent rainfall, making the task of finding dry wood a bit challenging. I wandered a bit further than usual, enjoying the solitude. About 20 minutes later, as I trudged back to the clearing with a modest bundle of somewhat dry sticks, I noticed something different. Another tent was now set up a short distance from my RV. Surprised, I paused. A man, presumably the owner of the tent, was there, adjusting the stakes in the ground. He looked up and caught my eye, offering a brief nod, which I returned. It was a simple acknowledgement, the unspoken hello of fellow campers. At first glance, there was nothing particularly unusual about him, but as I approached, I couldn't help but notice the condition of his tent. It was tattered and worn, with visible holes and frayed edges that fluttered in the gentle breeze. It struck me as odd, more a relic of countless adventures than a suitable shelter for the night. Putting my firewood down, I retreated to my RV for some privacy and a cold beer. From the window, I watched as he finished setting up. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, a certain hesitancy in his actions. He didn't seem to have much with him either, no backpack or usual camping gear that one might expect. My curiosity piqued. I found myself glancing out the window every so often, trying to make sense of the situation. After a while, I stepped out to start my campfire, the sun beginning to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows across the campground. The man had disappeared from view, and his tent stood oddly quiet against the backdrop of the darkening woods. The hours passed, and I sat by my fire, the crackling flames a comforting companion in the growing darkness. As night fully took hold, enveloping the campsite in darkness save for the circle of light cast by my fire, a sense of unease grew within me. The man had not returned to his tent, and the stillness was unsettling. I checked the time. Nearly 10 p.m. He had been gone for hours. Curiosity eventually got the better of me, and I decided to check if he was all right. As I approached his tent, calling out a tentative, "Hello? Anyone there?" there was no response. Peering into the tent through the holes, it was clear it was empty. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that something was amiss. I stood there in the middle of the campground, the silence of the night weighing heavily around me. Suddenly, a rustle from the edge of the woods caught my attention. Turning towards the sound, my eyes strained in the darkness, and then I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the trees, barely visible. Heart racing, I took a few steps back towards my RV. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. The fear that gripped me then was primal, a stark, terrifying realization that I was not alone. With shaking hands, I hurried back to the safety of my RV, locking the door behind me. From the window, I could still see the figure, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to be looking right at me. After a moment's hesitation, driven by fear and a desperate need for safety, I started the RV and didn't look back. As I drove away, the last glimpse of the campfire's glow fading behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that what had started as a peaceful escape had turned into a night of frightful shadows and unsettling mysteries. The haunting question of who, or what, had been watching me from the woods would linger long after I had left the campground behind. Last month, I experienced something straight out of a suspense thriller. Only this was real life, and it happened in the wild, untouched expanses of the Cascadian Peaks in Oregon, not on the silver screen. My buddy, Dave, and I, both 23 and fresh out of college, decided to escape the noise of our everyday lives for a 2-night backpacking trip. We've always been outdoor guys, camping, fishing, and the like. So this was our way of reconnecting with nature. We set off on a crisp Friday morning, our backpacks loaded with gear and high spirits. The hike to our campsite was about 5 miles, leading to a serene, secluded lake nestled among tall pines. We pitched our tent on a small, sandy beach on the lake's edge, far from the usual trails and tourist spots. As dusk turned to dark, we built a campfire by the lakeside. The stars above us were like scattered diamond dust against the black canvas of the night sky. We were deep in conversation about future plans, reminiscing about college days, when the unexpected sight of a flashlight beam dancing on the opposite shore caught my attention. "That's odd," I murmured, squinting across the dark expanse of water. Flashlights here weren't common, especially not late at night. Dave followed my gaze, his brow furrowing slightly. "Probably just another late hiker," he suggested, but his tone wasn't convincing. We tried to shrug it off, focusing back on our fire and the warmth it offered. However, the light didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to be moving erratically, bobbing along the lake's perimeter, inching closer to our campsite. "Do you think they're coming here?" Dave asked, an edge of concern lacing his voice as the light continued its slow, persistent approach. "Not sure, but let's not wait to find out," I replied, instinctively lowering my voice. We decided to retreat into the shadows of the woods nearby, seeking cover and a better vantage point. I grabbed my handgun, just a small precautionary measure we'd brought along, and Dave cradled his .22 rifle. We weren't looking for trouble, but in the wilderness, it was always better to be prepared. Hunkering down under a dense hemlock, we watched as the beam of light finally reached our campsite. The figure wielding the flashlight was a man, probably in his mid-40s, with a rugged beard and weathered face that spoke of a life outdoors. The alarming part, however, wasn't his sudden appearance. It was the pump-action shotgun slung casually over his shoulder. He prowled around the campsite with a predator's grace, his movements deliberate and searching. After a tense few minutes, He rummaged through our belongings, then stepped into our tent. When he emerged, he began to shout, "I know you're out there. Why don't you come out and say hello, my friend?" Dave and I barely breathed, our bodies rigid with tension. The man's voice was oddly cheerful, but his actions spoke of menace. He fired his shotgun into the woods, not far from our hiding spot. Each blast echoed like thunder through the silence of the night. Heart pounding, I watched as he swung his flashlight around, searching. After what seemed like an eternity, he grabbed Dave's backpack and some of our clothes drying by the fire, tossing them into the flames. The sight of our gear burning sent a wave of anger through me, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. Dave, his rifle aimed at the figure, whispered harshly, "Should I shoot?" "Only if he spots us and becomes a threat," I hissed back, gripping his arm. "Not before." Fortunately, the man didn't linger much longer. Eventually, he trudged off the way he had come, his flashlight beam disappearing into the night. We waited, hearts racing, until the light was just a faint glow on the opposite side of the lake. Then, with adrenaline fueling our actions, we darted out, grabbed what remained of our belongings, and fled back towards the trail. The trek back to the car was a blur of shadow and moonlight. By the time we reached my SUV, the first hints of dawn were coloring the eastern sky. We drove straight to the nearest police station, recounting our ordeal to an officer and later to a couple of forest rangers. That night in the Cascadian Peaks was meant to be an escape into the wilderness, a break from the civilized world. Instead, it became a stark reminder that the wild holds mysteries and dangers, some more human than we'd like to admit. As for the man with the shotgun, the police never did find him, adding just another unsolved mystery to the depths of the Cascadian Peaks. As the stranger's warning echoed in the darkness, Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of his words settling like a leaden blanket over our campsite. We tried to shake off the sense of foreboding that clung to us like a second skin, but the memory of the stranger's ominous parting shot lingered in the air, casting a pall over our evening. Despite our best efforts to carry on as normal, the atmosphere around the campfire had shifted, the crackling flames no longer offering the same warmth and comfort they had earlier. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through our veins, our senses heightened to the slightest hint of danger. But as the night wore on, the tension in the air only seemed to grow, fueled by the knowledge that we were not alone in the wilderness. The stranger's warning had left an indelible mark on our psyches, a constant reminder that danger lurked in the shadows, unseen but ever present. It was well past midnight when the first sign of trouble emerged, a faint rustling in the underbrush, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Mark and I exchanged wary glances, our hands instinctively reaching for the weapons we had brought with us. We had hoped it was just a trick of the wind, a harmless creature passing through the woods, but deep down, we knew better. The rustling grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround us on all sides, a symphony of sound that sent shivers down our spines. We huddled closer together, our eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, our hearts pounding in our chests. And then, he emerged from the shadows, a lone figure, silhouetted against the flickering firelight, his presence casting a pall over our campsite. He was tall and imposing, with a wild look in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. But it was the shotgun cradled in his arms that sent a bolt of fear racing through my veins. "Evening, boys," he said, his voice rough with years of disuse. "Mind if I join you by the fire?" My mind raced as I searched for the right words, my heart hammering in my chest. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and alone in the wilderness. A deadly combination that left us at the mercy of this mysterious stranger. "We're fine, thanks," Mark replied, his voice steady despite the tremor of fear that ran through him. The stranger nodded, a twisted smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Suit yourselves," he said, turning to walk away. But before he could disappear into the darkness, he paused, his gaze lingering on us with a predatory gleam. "Just remember," he said, his voice low and menacing, "you're not alone out here." With that chilling warning, he vanished into the night, leaving us alone with our fear and uncertainty. We sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air, until finally, Mark broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Well, that was unsettling," he said, his voice tinged with unease. I nodded in agreement, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Who was this man, and what did he want with us? And more importantly, how were we going to make it through the night with our lives intact? But as the hours passed and the darkness deepened, the answer to those questions remained elusive, lost in the inky blackness of the night. All we could do was wait, our hearts pounding in our chests as we braced ourselves for whatever horrors the wilderness had in store. Little did we know, the worst was yet to come.